when a humble waitress lifted a struggling man. She didn't know she was about to change her life forever with a single act of kindness, catching the eye of a billionaire. The small diner on the corner of the street was one of those places where people came every day without even thinking about it. It smelled of hot coffee, fried eggs, and freshly baked bread. The sound of plates clinking and conversations floating from table to table created a rhythm that felt familiar to everyone who stepped inside. The booths were always filled with regular truck drivers who stopped during their long routes. Office workers grabbing a quick bite, families with kids tugging at their sleeves, and older folks who just wanted company while sipping a warm drink. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen, and yet it was a part of the town's heartbeat. Among the waitresses who worked there was Emily. She was young, not more than 22, and had been working in the diner for almost 3 years. She was not the kind of girl people stared at in amazement. She wasn't rich, she didn't wear expensive clothes, and she didn't have much beyond her cheerful smile and her willingness to help anyone who walked through the door. Her hair was always tied neatly in a ponytail, her apron sometimes smudged with a coffee stain, but her eyes sparkled with kindness. For most customers, she was just a part of the background, someone who filled cups, wiped tables, and brought menus without being noticed much. Yet, there was something about her that made her different. She listened to people. She remembered the little details about their lives. She asked questions and smiled, and somehow made everyone feel a little less invisible. That morning had started like any other. The sunlight spilled through the diner's big windows, painting golden lines on the checkered floor. Emily moved quickly between the booths, refilling coffee cups and greeting customers with her usual warmth. A group of men in work uniforms joked loudly at one table. A young mother tried to keep her toddler calm at another, and an older couple sat quietly near the back, sharing a slice of pie. Everything was ordinary, predictable, almost boring in its familiarity, and then the door creaked open. At first, nobody paid much attention. People came and went all the time. But slowly heads began to turn. A man had walked in, and he looked out of place. His clothes were shabby, as if they had been worn too many times without care. His shoes were scuffed, almost falling apart, and his jacket looked 2 sizes too big, hanging loosely on his thin frame. His hair was messy, his beard untrimmed, and his eyes carried a heaviness that spoke of exhaustion. Looked like someone who hadn't been treated kindly for a very long time. The diner grew quieter for a moment as he stood near the entrance, unsure of where to go. Some people frowned, others exchanged looks, and a few whispered to each other. One of the men at the corner table let out a short laugh, and soon his friends joined in. To them, the man seemed like nothing more than a beggar who had wandered into the wrong place. But Emily noticed something different. She saw not just the worn-out clothes or the unshaven face, but the way he shifted his weight uncomfortably as if he was embarrassed to even be standing there. His eyes scanned the room, almost pleading, but quickly darted down when he caught someone staring. He looked like a man who had been invisible for too long. Without hesitation, Emily walked over to him with the same bright smile she gave to every other customer. She greeted him warmly and asked if he wanted a seat. The man hesitated, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. After a moment, he nodded slightly, and she guided him to a small booth near the window. She placed a menu in front of him, though she noticed the way his hands trembled as he reached for it. As she poured him a glass of water, Emily asked softly if he was having a good day. The man gave a weak smile, the kind of smile that had tried to hide years of struggle, and said quietly that he was just tired. She didn't press him for details. Instead, she let him take his time with the menu, though she noticed he didn't really look at it. His eyes lingered on the prices, and then he set it down carefully, almost as if he was afraid of breaking it. Meanwhile, laughter rippled through the diner. The group of men in the corner chuckled, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What's he gonna buy? A glass of water?" one of them said. A few others smirked, shaking their heads. To them it was a spectacle, something to laugh at on an otherwise dull day. The mother with the toddler pulled her child closer, avoiding looking at the man altogether, while the older couple just kept their heads down, pretending they didn't notice. Emily, however, chose not to listen to the whispers or the laughter. She leaned closer and asked the man gently if he wanted anything to eat. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes dropped, and he swallowed hard before admitting that he didn't have enough money. The words seemed to weigh heavily on him, as though saying them out loud stripped away the little dignity he still held. The room grew louder with laughter at that point. One of the men slapped his hand on the table, mocking the situation. Even the diner's owner, standing behind the counter, gave Emily a disapproving look, silently warning her not to waste time on someone who couldn't pay. But Emily didn't hesitate. She placed a comforting hand on the table and told the man not to worry. She said she would bring him something warm to eat on the house. Before he could protest, she had already turned toward the kitchen, her steps quick and determined. The laughter continued behind her, but Emily ignored it. To her, this wasn't a joke. This was a person who needed kindness, and she wasn't about to deny him that. She returned a few minutes later with a plate of hot food eggs, toast, and a steaming bowl of soup. The man looked at the meal in disbelief, his eyes watering as he tried to thank her. Emily just smiled, saying it was nothing, and placed the fork gently in front of him as he began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as though it was the first real meal he had had in days. The noise of the diner faded into the background. For him, in that moment, there was only the warmth of the food and the unexpected kindness of the young waitress who had seen him not as a burden, but as a human being. Emily stayed nearby, not to hover, but to make sure he felt welcome. She refilled his glass, asked if the food was good, and even sat down for a short moment when she noticed his hand shaking too much to steady the fork. She steadied it with a smile, pretending it was part of her job so he wouldn't feel embarrassed. And while the rest of the diner laughed and whispered, Emily carried on as if none of it mattered. To her, kindness mattered more than appearances. Respect mattered more than money. And dignity mattered more than fitting in with the crowd. What nobody in that diner knew was that this ordinary act of kindness on an ordinary day was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Not only for Emily, but for everyone who had been in that diner that afternoon. But for now, it was just Emily, the tired man, and the quiet bond of kindness that had formed between them. The man sat there in silence for a while, his eyes fixed on the plate of food Emily had placed before him. The warmth of the steam rose gently, carrying the smell of buttered toast and soup that was rich and filling. He picked up the fork with unsteady hands and hesitated before taking the first bite, almost as if he needed permission. Emily gave him a reassuring nod, and slowly he tasted the food. The moment the flavors touched his tongue, his eyes closed for a second, and he let out a small sigh. It was the kind of sigh that came not only from hunger being satisfied, but from relief, from comfort that felt long forgotten. Around the diner, the laughter and whispers did not stop. The men in the corner made exaggerated gestures, pretending to beg for food as a cruel joke. They pointed at Emily and the man, nudging each other and laughing louder. Even the young mother shook her head slightly, whispering something to herself as if she couldn't understand why a waitress would waste her money on someone who clearly couldn't give anything back. The owner of the diner stood behind the counter, arms folded, his eyes narrowing at Emily as though she had committed a crime by feeding someone who had no money. But Emily ignored them all. She poured coffee into another customer's cup, wiped down a table, and returned to check on the man. She smiled as she noticed that he was eating slowly, carefully, savoring every bite as though he didn't know when he would taste something like this again. When she asked him how it was, he gave her a shy smile and whispered that it was the best meal he had eaten in a very long time. She leaned closer, speaking softly so that only he could hear. She told him that everyone deserved to eat, that no one should ever feel ashamed of being hungry. His hands trembled as he set down the fork, his eyes lowering to the table. He tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, he managed to whisper a thank you, his voice hoarse and heavy with emotion. Emily reached out and lightly touched the edge of the table with her fingertips, a small gesture to remind him that he was welcome here. The group of men at the corner table saw this and laughed louder. "Looks like she's found herself a new charity case," one of them said, slapping the table. The others burst out laughing, not even trying to hide their cruelty. Their voices carried across the room, but Emily pretended not to hear them. She knew they're kind men who thought kindness was weakness, men who found joy in mocking others. When she went to the counter to collect another order, the diner's owner leaned toward her, his voice low but sharp. He reminded her that this was a business, not a shelter, and that she should not give away food for free. Emily met his gaze without fear. She told him calmly that she had paid for the man's meal out of her own pocket, and that it wasn't costing the diner anything. The owner grumbled, clearly unhappy, but he had no argument against her words. Turned away, shaking his head, muttering that customers were supposed to bring in money, not pity. Emily didn't let his words sink into her heart. She had seen the way the man's hands shook when he held the fork, the way his eyes watered when he whispered thank you. No amount of scolding from her boss or laughter from strangers could make her regret what she had done. The man ate slowly, his back hunched slightly, as though he wanted to disappear into the booth. Every time he raised the fork, he glanced around, as if expecting someone to drag him out. Each bite seemed to carry both joy and fear that he could eat, fear that it could be taken away at any second. Emily stayed close, filling his water glass whenever it emptied, and giving him small smiles to remind him that he was safe. At one point, one of the laughing men got up and walked toward their booth. He leaned on the edge of the table, smirking, and asked the man if the food tasted good for someone who couldn't pay for it. His words dripped with mockery, and a few customers nearby chuckled under their breath. The shabby man lowered his head, too embarrassed to respond. Emily, however, stepped forward without hesitation. She told the man firmly to return to his table and stop bothering her customer. Her voice was calm but strong, filled with a quiet authority that surprised even those watching. The man blinked at her, startled by her boldness, then laughed awkwardly and returned to his friends, pretending it was all a joke. The diner's atmosphere had shifted now. Some people continued to mock, while others began to feel uncomfortable. A few looked at Emily with a kind of respect, though they didn't say anything out loud. The older couple near the back exchanged a glance, their eyes softening as they watched Emily stand up for someone who had no voice. The young mother, though still unsure, looked thoughtful as she rocked her toddler gently. Meanwhile, the shabby man finished his meal slowly. When the last bite was gone, he set the fork down carefully and sat back, his shoulders slumping as if the food had not only filled his stomach, but also loosened the heavy weight pressing on him. He looked up at Emily with eyes that were misty but grateful. He whispered again that he was sorry for causing her trouble, sorry for not being able to pay, sorry for being laughed at because of her kindness. Emily shook her head and told him there was nothing to be sorry for. She said that people were quick to judge, but it didn't mean they were right. She told him that dignity wasn't measured by money, and that he deserved to be treated with respect like anyone else. The man's lips trembled, and though he tried to hold it back, a single tear slipped down his cheek. Quickly wiped it away, embarrassed, but Emily pretended not to notice, giving him space to keep his pride. By now, the mocking voices had grown quieter. The group of men still whispered, but their laughter wasn't as loud as before. The confidence they had shown earlier seemed to waver, perhaps because deep inside they knew Emily was right. The older couple stood up to leave, and as they passed Emily, the woman gave her a small nod and a faint smile, a silent gesture of approval. Emily returned to the man once more, asking if he wanted anything else. He shook his head, saying the meal had been more than enough. He thanked her again, his voice stronger this time, and told her she had given him more than food, she had given him kindness. Emily smiled softly, her heart warmed by his words. Though the diner looked the same walls, the same booths, the same chatter, the air felt different now. Something had shifted. The act of kindness, simple yet powerful, had broken through the coldness of mockery and judgment. It was as if Emily had drawn a line between cruelty and compassion, and everyone had been forced to see it. The man sat quietly, sipping the last of his water, and Emily stood nearby, wiping a table, but keeping him in her sight. She didn't know who he was or where he had come from, but she knew she had done the right thing. She didn't expect anything in return. To her, it was enough to know that someone who had been hungry and invisible now felt, even for a short while, seen and cared for. What no one in that diner could have guessed was that this small moment, It's a simple act of paying for a stranger's meal was the beginning of something far greater. The laughter, the whispers, the scolding, it would all fade in the face of what was about to happen. But in that moment, all Emily cared about was that the man had eaten, that he had smiled, and that kindness had been stronger than cruelty. The air inside the diner was heavy with the sound of laughter and clinking cups, but beneath it all was the sharp edge of mockery that still hung around. The shabby man and the young waitress who had chosen to help him. Emily moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and delivering plates, but she kept glancing back at the man she had fed. He sat quietly, his head bowed, hands wrapped around the empty glass of water, as though it was something precious. Looked calmer now, but still nervous, as if he might be asked to leave at any moment. The group of men in the corner had grown tired of their jokes, though they still looked toward the booth with smirks. Some of the other customers had returned to their meals, pretending not to notice what was happening, though every so often their eyes flickered in that direction. The owner behind the counter polished a glass, watching with disapproval, as though waiting for Emily to make another mistake. The diner seemed to have settled into its uneasy rhythm again, and then, without warning, the door opened. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk into the diner, but this time the effect was different. The moment the man stepped in, the air seemed to shift. He carried himself with confidence, his suit perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a shine that caught the light. His presence commanded attention, not because he was loud or dramatic, but because he was someone impossible to ignore. Heads turned almost instantly, conversations trailed off, and for a few seconds, the diner was filled with silence. Several customers recognized him immediately. A buzz of whispers spread across the room, people leaning toward one another with wide eyes. It was a billionaire, a man whose face had been on television, in newspapers, and on the internet. He was famous, not just for his wealth but for his reputation as a philanthropist, someone who gave millions away to charities and causes. Even those who didn't know his name knew his face, and they could not believe he was standing in their small-town diner. The owner, who had been glaring at Emily only moments before, suddenly straightened his posture and rushed to wipe the counter. He forced a smile, adjusting his tie nervously, as though preparing to welcome royalty. The group of men in the corner stopped laughing, their smirks fading into expressions of shock and curiosity. The mother with the toddler froze, her mouth open, while the older couple near the door whispered quietly to each other, their eyes wide. Everyone assumed the billionaire would walk to the best table, the one reserved for important guests, or perhaps to the counter where the owner was practically tripping over himself to appear welcoming. Instead, to everyone's astonishment, he walked past all of them without a glance. His eyes moved across the room with purpose, until they settled on the shabby man sitting in the booth by the window. The diner fell into stunned silence. Forks hovered in midair, cups paused halfway to lips, and all eyes followed him as he crossed the room, his polished shoes tapped against the floor, echoing in the quiet space. He stopped at the booth where the man sat, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile. "John," said in a voice filled with warmth, so greeting an old friend. The shabby man looked up slowly, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment he seemed almost unsure if he was really being spoken to. Then recognition lit his face. He stood up quickly, though clumsily, as though he hadn't expected to see this man at all. His lips trembled, and he tried to speak. But the billionaire had already reached out and embraced him tightly, pulling him into a hug that silenced the last whispers in the diner. The scene was almost unbelievable to everyone watching. A billionaire, someone who could sit with presidents and kings, was embracing a man who looked like he hadn't had a new shirt in years. The group of mocking men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier laughter now tasting bitter in their mouths. The mother with the toddler stared, forgetting even to hush her child, and the older couple leaned forward as though afraid to miss a single detail. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. She had felt something was different about the shabby man, something more than what his appearance showed. But she had never imagined this. The billionaire sat down in the booth without hesitation, motioning for the shabby man to do the same. He spoke with him in low tones at first, words that only they could hear, but the warmth in his voice carried through the room. At one point, he placed his hand on the man's shoulder, a gesture of deep respect and friendship. Slowly, the conversations in the diner began again, but they were different now. The whispers were filled with shock and curiosity, not mockery. People leaned toward each other, asking how they knew each other, what it all meant, and what would happen next. The men in the corner avoided looking at the booth now, their earlier arrogance crumbling as they realized they had mocked someone who clearly meant the world to one of the most powerful men in the country. The owner of the diner tried to approach. His smile stretched wide as he offered to prepare something special. But the billionaire politely waved him away, insisting he wanted to spend his time with his friend in peace. The rejection stung, and the owner retreated to the counter, his forced smile fading into a frustrated frown. Emily, however, found herself drawn to the booth. She approached cautiously, unsure if she should interrupt. But before she could say anything, the billionaire looked up at her with kind eyes. He thanked her softly for taking care of his friend. His words were gentle but carried a weight that made Emily's cheeks flush with surprise. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself unable to say anything beyond a quiet, "You're welcome." The billionaire's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as though he already knew what had happened, as though he could see through the laughter and the whispers that had filled the room earlier. Then he returned to his conversation with the shabby man, speaking with the ease of someone who had known him for years. The entire diner watched, still stunned by the unexpected turn of events. The shabby man, who had entered only an hour earlier looking like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, was now sitting with a billionaire who treated him not as a stranger, not as someone beneath him, but as an equal, as a friend. For Emily, the moment felt surreal. She had only wanted to do something kind, to give someone a meal and a little dignity. She had expected nothing in return, and yet here she was, watching as her simple choice to help had opened a door to something extraordinary. She couldn't explain it. She felt that everything was about to change, not just for the shabby man, but for her as well. And for everyone who had been in that diner that day. The laughter that had once filled the room had vanished. The mocking voices were gone. In their place was a heavy silence filled with awe, curiosity, and a touch of shame from those who had judged too quickly. And in the center of it all sat Emily, the shabby man, and the billionaire whose arrival had turned an ordinary afternoon into a moment that no one in the diner would ever forget. The diner was unusually quiet now. The sound of spoons clinking against cups and chairs scraping the floor had faded into the background. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on the booth by the window where the billionaire and the shabby man sat, together, speaking in low voices. People were trying to pretend they were minding their own business. But the truth was that the sight in front of them was far too strange to ignore. A man who looked like he had nothing in the world was being treated like family by one of the richest men alive. Emily stood nearby. Holding an empty coffee pot in her hand, her heart still racing, she kept stealing glances at them, trying to piece together what was happening. She had seen surprise many times in her life, but nothing like this. A few minutes ago, people had laughed at the man, mocked him openly, and whispered that he didn't belong here. The same people sat in stiff silence, their shame hidden behind forced sips of coffee and uncomfortable fidgeting. Finally, the billionaire leaned back in his seat, his smile wide as he looked around the diner. He seemed fully aware of all the eyes staring at him, but he didn't mind. Instead, he placed a hand on the shabby man's shoulder and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I want you all to know," said his voice steady. "This man is not what you think he is." The room grew even quieter. People stopped. Chewing forks hovered in midair, and even the toddler at the corner table fell silent, as if the whole world was waiting for the next words. "This is John," the billionaire continued. "He has been my business partner for many years. He is the reason many of my projects succeeded. Without him, I would not be where I am today." The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled across the diner. Some customers exchanged shocked glances, while others shifted in their seats uncomfortably, recalling how they had mocked him only moments earlier. The men in the corner, who had been the loudest, now looked down at their plates, their faces turning red. They poked at their food, pretending they hadn't said anything cruel. But their shame was written all over them. The billionaire wasn't finished. He explained that John had chosen to live simply for a while, to step away from the world of money and titles. He said John had been observing human behavior for a project they were working on, something that involved kindness, empathy, and the true character of people when faced with someone in need. "Do you know why he came here looking like this?" the billionaire asked, his voice carrying across the room. "'Cause he wanted to see how strangers would treat him when they thought he had nothing." Every face in the diner stiffened at his words. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, like a mirror suddenly being held up to the crowd. Everyone who had laughed, whispered, or looked away now remembered exactly how they had behaved, and none of them felt proud of it. The billionaire smiled warmly at Emily then, his eyes filled with gratitude. "But one person here," he said, "saw past the clothes, past the tired face, past what the world thinks of as value. One person treated him with dignity when everyone else turned away." Emily froze, realizing he was speaking about her. Her cheeks flushed red, and she gripped the coffee pot tighter, unsure of what to do. The entire diner turned their eyes toward her, and for the first time that day, the laughter was gone. Instead, there was awe, respect, and for some, deep regret. The shabby man Joan looked at Emily with watery eyes. He nodded slightly, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He didn't need to. The gratitude in his expression said more than words ever could. The billionaire stood up now, his tall frame commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He placed his hand gently on Emily's shoulder, lowering his voice so it was just for her, but loud enough that others could hear too. "What you did," he said, "was worth more than any amount of money. You gave respect when it was denied. You gave kindness when it was mocked. That young lady is the greatest wealth of all." Emily's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. She hadn't done it for praise, hadn't done it for recognition. All she had wanted was to help someone who looked like he needed help. Yet here she was, standing at the center of something extraordinary. The room felt transformed. The same tables, the same booths, the same coffee-scented air, but everything was different now. The people who had mocked felt the weight of their actions pressing down on them. The owner behind the counter, who had scolded Emily for wasting time, now looked as though the ground might swallow him whole. He tried to avoid the billionaire's eyes, wiping the counter furiously as if pretending to be busy would erase his earlier disapproval. The group of men who had laughed the loudest were silent now. One of them cleared his throat awkwardly, muttering something under his breath about not knowing who the shabby man was. But excuses sounded weak in the heavy silence, and no one paid attention meanwhile. The older couple who had sat quietly throughout the ordeal now smiled softly at Emily. They seemed proud, as though they had witnessed something pure in a world that often forgot about kindness. The young mother with the toddler gave Emily a small nod, her earlier judgment replaced by admiration. Even those who hadn't mocked openly now felt the sting of guilt for not stepping forward, for not showing compassion when it had been needed most. The billionaire returned to his seat, sitting beside John as if nothing about his friend's appearance mattered. He spoke to him with respect, listening closely as John shared a few quiet words. It was clear to everyone that their bond was genuine, built on years of trust and loyalty, not money or appearances. Emily stood still, her mind whirling with the weight of what had just unfolded. She had never expected her simple decision to buy a meal for a stranger would lead to this moment. Yet here it was, unfolding in front of everyone, like a scene from a story that no one would have believed if they hadn't seen it. With their own eyes, the billionaire glanced once more at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of those who sat in silence. "It's easy to be kind when you expect something in return," he said softly. "The real test of character is how you treat someone who can give you nothing. Today, one person in this room passed that test. The rest of you will have to live with the way you chose to act." The words struck deep. They weren't shouted, they weren't harsh, but they carried more weight than anger ever could. People shifted in their seats uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. For some, it was a lesson they would never forget. For others, it was a wound to their pride that might take a long time to heal. Emily lowered her gaze, not wanting to stand in the spotlight, but the shabby man John looked at her again. This time, he found his voice, spoke softly but clearly. You saw me when no one else did. You gave me respect when others gave me shame. I will never forget that. The billionaire smiled, nodding at his words. Neither will I, he added, his voice warm but firm. The moment hung in the air, heavy yet beautiful. A simple diner, an ordinary day, and an act of kindness that had revealed truths about everyone in the room. The mocking had turned to silence. The judgment had turned to shame, and the kindness of one young waitress had become the brightest light in a place that had moments earlier been filled with cruelty. No one in that diner would ever see the shabby man the same way again. More importantly, they would never see Emily the same way again either. She had reminded them all, without meaning to, of the power of treating someone with dignity. She had shown them what true character looked like, and as the diner slowly returned to life, cups clinking and conversations starting again, every person there carried with them the memory of the moment when everything had changed. The diner still buzzed with the weight of what had just happened. People were trying to return to their meals, but the usual noise and chatter were gone. Instead, there was a quietness, a heaviness that hung over every table. The smell of coffee still lingered, plates still clinked, and children still shifted in their seats, but the atmosphere had changed forever. Nobody could forget the billionaire's words. Nobody could ignore the shame that pressed down on them. Emily stood near the counter, unsure of what to do with herself. She had never liked attention, and now the eyes of nearly everyone in the diner had been on her. Her cheeks were still warm, and her hands trembled slightly as she held a coffee pot. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, at least not in her own eyes. She had only done what felt right, what her heart told her to do. Yet here she was, being praised by a man who could buy the entire diner 10 times over. The billionaire and John continued to talk quietly in the booth. But it wasn't the kind of serious discussion people expected. They laughed softly, shared stories, and leaned close, like old friends, catching up after a long time apart. Every so often, the billionaire's gaze would drift to Emily, and his smile would soften, as if he saw something rare and valuable in her actions. Finally, the billionaire stood once more. His tall frame and commanding presence drew every eye in the room back to him. He placed both hands on the table in front of him, then turned his attention to Emily. "Young lady," said warmly, "you may not realize what you've done today, but you gave my friend something no amount of money can buy. You gave him dignity, compassion, and respect. For that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." The diner fell silent again. Emily froze, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say to someone like him. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, that anyone should have done the same, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. She had seen the way people had treated John, the way they had laughed and mocked. She had been the only one to step forward. The billionaire continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I make my living building businesses and giving money to good causes. But today, you reminded me of something even more important, that true kindness is not about wealth, it is about heart. And you, Emily, have a heart greater than anyone in this room." Her name on his lips made her blink in surprise. She had never introduced herself. Somehow, he had learned it, perhaps from overhearing her coworkers. Hearing her name spoken with such respect made her chest tighten. The billionaire reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather folder. He opened it and laid a document on the table. "I want to offer you something," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "You said nothing today about wanting anything in return. But I believe people like you deserve a chance to live the life they dream of. So here is my offer, a scholarship fully funded for you to attend business school. And when you finish, I will give you the resources to open your own restaurant." The diner gasped collectively. Forks clattered against plates, and a few people even leaned forward in disbelief. Emily stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her hands gripping the coffee pot tighter. For a long moment she couldn't move. She thought she must have misheard him. A billionaire offering her a future, a chance. To chase a dream she had barely dared to speak aloud. Her eyes filled with tears. She had always dreamed of owning her own place someday, a small restaurant where she could cook and serve people the way she wanted, a place where kindness was part of every meal. But dreams like that felt impossible for someone like her, someone who lived paycheck to paycheck, who worked double shifts just to cover rent and groceries. The billionaire smiled at her hesitation. "You don't have to answer now," he said gently. "But you have earned it. Not because of your resume, not because of your wealth, but because of who you are." Emily's lips trembled as she tried to speak. "At last," she whispered. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing." John spoke up from the booth, his voice soft but filled with emotion. He looked at her with eyes that glistened with tears. "Just keep being who you are. That's all the world needs." The words broke something inside her, and tears slid down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed, but the billionaire gave her a reassuring nod. "Tears of kindness are nothing to be ashamed of," he said softly. Around the diner, the mood had changed completely. The men in the corner who had mocked earlier now looked ashamed, their heads lowered. They shifted, uncomfortably, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The mother with the toddler gave Emily a smile, her earlier doubt replaced with admiration. The older couple near the door beamed proudly, as though they had witnessed a miracle. Even the owner behind the counter, who had scolded Emily before, now stood with his mouth slightly open, realizing how wrong he had been. The billionaire placed the folder on the counter and told Emily to take her time, to think about it. He wasn't offering her charity, he was offering her an opportunity, a chance to turn her kindness into something bigger, something lasting. Emily nodded slowly, still overwhelmed. She felt as if her entire life had changed in the span of an afternoon. Just hours ago, she had been another waitress serving coffee in a small-town diner. Now she was being told she had the chance to chase her dream. It's all because she had chosen to show kindness when no one else did. As the billionaire and John prepared to leave, the diner remained hushed. Every person seemed caught in their own thoughts. Reflecting on what they had seen, the men in the corner, who had once been the loudest, now whispered apologies under their breath, though no one was listening. The owner of the diner humbled, approached Emily quietly and muttered something about being proud of her, though his voice shook with guilt. Emily simply nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. John stood and turned to her. He looked different now, not because his clothes had changed, but because his spirit seemed lighter, brighter. He extended his hand and said softly, "You gave me something more valuable than money today. You gave me humanity. I will never forget that, and neither will my friend." Emily shook his hand, her tears threatening to fall again. She whispered, "I only did what anyone should have done." John smiled sadly. "That may be true, but only you did it." The billionaire placed his arm around John's shoulders, and together they walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he turned back one last time to look at Emily. His eyes held warmth and certainty as he said, "Remember, true wealth is not counted in dollars, but in the lives we touch. You've already proven you are the richest person in this room." And with that, they left. For a long while, the diner remained quiet. People stared at their plates, ashamed of their earlier laughter, humbled by the lesson they had just witnessed. Some looked at Emily with respect, others with admiration, but all of them knew. They would never forget what had happened that day. Emily finally set down the coffee pot and leaned against the counter. Her heart was full, her mind spinning, but above all, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She didn't know what the future held. She knew one thing for certain. Kindness had changed everything. And though the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the clinking of cups, the chatter of voices, the smell of frying bacon, nothing was truly the same. Everyone who had been there that afternoon carried with them the memory of the day when a shabby man walked in. A waitress chose kindness, and a billionaire reminded them all what truly mattered in life.